Hi everyone. My name is Rachel Biscocho, and I'm the acting executive director for the Stuyvesant High School Alumni Association. I'm also a Stuyvesant alum myself, class of 2012. So we would like to welcome all of you to the Stuyvesant Community Discussion on Anti-Asian Violence. We hope this event will provide an opportunity for Stuyvesant alumni and current Stuyvesant students to share their experiences, opinions, and questions on recent acts of racism and violence against the AAPI community, how racism and bias manifest, and how positive change can start within our own community. So with that, we would like to start with opening remarks from the president of the Stuyvesant Alumni Association, Sue Kim, class of 93. Sue, take it away.
Thank you, Rachel. Good evening, and thanks for joining everyone for this incredibly important conversation. Look, I mean, we all understand the model minority stereotype that whatever occurs, we sort of just take it. And I think that this is a very important time and difficult time for us to just try to understand and surface these issues. So with that, it's our great pleasure to on behalf of the association to welcome you all to host this conversation with longtime friends of mine. With that, I want to turn it over to our esteemed Principal Singh. So, Principal.
Thank you, Sue, and good evening, everyone. We want to thank you again for joining us tonight for this important conversation. My name is Singh Yu, and I'm the proud principal of Stuyvesant High School. I want to first start by thanking our Alumni Association for organizing this important event, particularly in response to the anti-Asian violence that's impacted not only our school community, but our city and our entire country. We're fortunate to have such an amazing partner who can quickly bring together and mobilize our current students and alumni to learn together. I also want to thank our incredible panelists that we have tonight. We have a group of powerful voices who are going to continue to raise the visibility of Asian Americans and the vast diversity within our Asian American communities and raising it to the various networks that they are in. It's really important that our voice and visibility continue to be raised, particularly as we're going through this kind of tumultuous time. I also want to thank our staff and current school community. Again, we're here and we're here to support our young people as they're experiencing this and seeing everything around them. All the violence and different acts that are happening across our city and across the country. I know our young people are trying to make sense of this, and again, it's important to have and surround our young people with these amazing adults, caring adults who can help them try to make sense of what's happening. And again, that involves our faculty, our families, and clearly our alumni and all our partners who are involved with Stuyvesant. I also want to finally thank everyone who's participating and listening and learning tonight. The first step in understanding is to hear from the voices and the experiences that our Asian Americans share and again, are experiencing. And the way to learn and understand is to first listen. And so tonight is really an amazing opportunity to do just that. As a principal of Stuyvesant High School, where more than 70% of our students identify as Asian, it's truly an important event where we can come together, listen, learn from one another, and continue to raise the visibility for all Asian Americans. So again, thank you everyone, and really important to have all of you as we continue this great evening and this important conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Yu. It is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator and fellow Sty alum, Chris Kwok, class of 92. I'll have Chris tell us a little bit more about himself and also welcome each of the other panelists.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much. It's an important moment to talk to the students, the alumni, the parents, and the larger community. And it's hopefully a time tonight where we can have a real discussion and learn from each other. I am a mediator. I'm a lawyer. I'm a mediator in labor and employment in the city. And, I was the co-executive editor of a report put out by the Asian American Bar Association about anti-Asian violence. And I'm joined by an esteemed panel that has just done amazing work, in this area, and have made enormous contributions to advancing the fight against anti-Asian violence. I'm going to introduce Young Chen. He's a former, actually everybody's a former lawyer. So I'm just going to put it out there. Everyone there is a former lawyer. So think about it if you really want to go to law school. But Young Chen is a former antitrust litigator who has led AAPI, Asian American Bar Association of New York, as its executive director for at least 10 years now. And together, under his leadership, AAPI has taken a leading role in education and advocacy related to anti-Asian violence. We also have Joanne Kwong, also a former lawyer, who is a second-generation business owner in Chinatown, Pearl River Mart, and an important cultural institution, as well as business in Chinatown, and a community activist. And she's going to tell us about her experience at Stein, and also what she's doing as a small business owner. And then, of course, last but not least, we have Congresswoman Grace Meng, who is leading the fight in DC on so many fronts, and has been a great ally to AAPI, and also in leading the fight against anti-Asian violence. And she's in a car, coming back from DC to Queens and joining our panel tonight because of how important this issue is, and of course, how important this panel is. And I'm going to sort of give the mic to Congresswoman Meng right now to tell us a little bit about the legislative efforts as well as the other efforts that she's been a part of in DC.
Thank you so much, Chris, for the kind introduction, and thank you for your leadership. Thank you to Principal Yu, to President Soo Kim, for helping to convene us all together today. And of course, to my good friends, Young Chen at AAPI, to Joanne Kwong and Ashley Stevens, my classmates too from high school. It's always a privilege for me to be here with you. And thank you especially to all the students, the parents, the families who are here today. We are all gathering here today for you. We want to make sure that we are providing this space. And these are really, I hope, just starter conversations of deeper, longer conversations that we need to have, and creating further actions that will help us become more impactful community members. I know that our community in New York City and across the country has really been fearful in the last few months, the last year, but especially the last few months. We have seen the number of incidents of hate skyrocket in the last year. We all know that about the number of 3,800 plus incidents that have happened across the country to so many people. And we know, we all have personal testimonies from people that it's happened to that have probably not even reported it. And I know that people are scared to let their parents and their grandparents out. They're scared to let their children play outside, even when it's nice, because of fear for getting harassed or bullied. And I want to take this moment to thank so many community leaders from way beyond the Asian American community. And I know that, for example, with Chris and Sue, I've been part of non-Stuyvesant activities where you have been really leading the way in engaging with leaders in other ethnic communities to make sure that we are working together as allies. As New Yorkers, just in the last 2 years or so, we have often had diverse showings of New Yorkers march together. We've marched together against anti-Semitism. We have marched to protect Black lives. And now we are seeing other community leaders stand with our community. And I'm so incredibly heartened because I have never in my entire life seen such a widespread showing of support from people who are not Asian American, people who might not look like me or who share a similar background as me. And I've never seen such a widespread showing of support for people in our Asian American community. And I'm incredibly heartened. Oftentimes, you all know, Asian Americans are either seen as invisible, without a voice, or we are seen as outsiders and foreigners. And I think that it's really important reminder for us, and something that I've learned more about this year is the importance of speaking up. And not just speaking up when something bad happens to us or our community, but speaking up when something bad happens to anyone, right? I was on a town hall with the president of the NAACP a few days ago, and he said something that really resonated with me. He talks about the importance of being a friend before you need a friend. And I think that that's a really important motto for us to be reminded of. And so I just wanted to put that out there to remind us about how we can always think of more ways to be mutually supportive of each other. We've all had the experience of growing up where people have made fun of us in various ways, making fun of our eyes, making fun of our food, complimenting us on our English skills, telling us to go back. And most of these incidents have not put us in physical danger. Many times it's happened with our relatives who might not know English. And when they ask, what did that person say? We kind of just brush it off. And most of the times when it happened to me in my life, I never spoke up about it, right? And so this again has really reminded me the importance of speaking up. And people ask who aren't Asian American, how can I help? And we ask them to please speak up when they see something or when they hear someone say something that to someone might seem like a joke, but is actually very harmful and hurtful. And to make sure that they are including us. When people are talking about different diverse communities, Asian Americans are often left out completely. We are not mentioned, and we often have to remind people, leaders of all sectors and all political parties, that our stories need to be included too. I'll end with an update on legislation that we're working on at the federal level. This actually is a good time for us to chat. So Senator Hirono and I are working on legislation and pushing bills that would do a couple of things. It would provide more money for community groups that are really on the front lines of helping our community. Imagine that number of 3,800 incidents that all of us have probably heard about. Imagine the lack of stories and articles that would have not existed had we not had that data. And you know where that data came from? It came from one local nonprofit organization. And while that's wonderful and wonderfully generous of them, that's not their job. And they shouldn't have had to be responsible for recording and reporting incidents that have happened across the country to our community. This legislation would require the Department of Justice to have dedicated personnel and resources to keep track of these incidents. There's no unified way right now for different states to accurately and sufficiently report these incidents to the federal government. No one's really keeping track in an effective way. We also want to give local governments more resources to make it easier for people to report. Whenever someone talks about these incidents, our natural reaction is always to tell them to just go report it. That's a lot more easily said than done. If a newer immigrant or a grandma who might not speak English or is disabled, if something happens to them, they can't just easily go to the police precinct and report it. We've had incidents happen to people who are on their way to work. They can't just take off work and wait a long time for a police officer to report this. And so we want to make sure that our local governments are given the tools so we can have online reporting and also in multiple languages as well. The last thing I will say is something that's not always popular, but I think it's important to say. We are not going to hate crime our way out of this. If we charge every single perpetrator with a hate crime and prosecute them, it's not going to solve our problem. 25% of these incidents this year in New York have been with people who have had mental health issues. And that's a whole nother story for another day, where we need much more investment in mental health programs including for the Asian American community. We want to make sure that we are getting the data out there on these types of incidents, getting a fuller picture so that our government can properly address these issues. Finally, for real, we actually just came back from Washington, D.C. Our Congressional Asian Caucus, some of us met with President Biden and Vice President Harris today to talk about this specific issue. They are very concerned. President Biden has taken some important first steps in addressing this issue. They want to do everything they can. They've even gone to Atlanta, Georgia, to meet with the local Asian American leaders in Atlanta to see what they need and what they can do. So we talked about this legislation, which he has publicly supported. We've also talked about going forward, the importance of education. We have not learned enough in this country about the Asian American history and contributions to this country. You know, we barely learned about Chinese building the railroad, Japanese Americans being incarcerated, slaves building the US Capitol. We did not learn enough about all of this. And our history is American history too. And that is very important to, you know, break down in the long term, these walls of biases. So thank you so much for including me today. I'm so honored to be with the Stuyvesant family. We have a lot more work to do. This is not the last time we will chat or meet at all. So I look forward to working with all of you together.
Thank you, Congresswoman. And you know that is that is sort of from the heat of the moment right now off the plane from DC. So you guys, we're really lucky to have that update. You know, one point is that, you know, without the data from Stop AAPI Hate, which was a nonprofit that took all these reports online, you know, we wouldn't be able to make these policy arguments. And part of the legislative push is to say, you know what, really, that's the government's role. And if it hasn't been doing that, it's invisible, right? We think about this recurring motif of invisibility. And this is an important moment for Asian Americans politically, socially, and across the board in every sort of aspect. And so, you know, that's one of the reasons why this forum is so important. And you know, I just want to sort of step back now. We're going to present, Young Chen and I, the report from AAPI. You know, that's going to give a little background, dive a little bit more into the statistics, and then we're going to have Joanne Kwong speak for a little bit, and then we're going to turn to a discussion. So without further ado, Young.
Thanks, Chris. Before I start, again, I want to thank the Alumni Association for inviting AAPI to speak. And we have a lot to say, not a lot of time. Trying to share my screen, and of course, during the testing, it worked perfectly, and now it's not cooperating, but let me see if we have a little more luck here. All right, here goes nothing. All right. So this is the Albany report. The full title is A Rising Tide of Hate and Crime Against Asian Americans in New York During COVID-19, Impact, Causes, Solutions. Chris is a co-executive editor. The other co-executive editor is a woman named Karen King, who at the time was counsel at Paul Weiss. So this report is co-authored with Paul Weiss. If you want a hard copy, happy to mail it to you. Just email me. I'll drop my email in the chat later. But this slide deck is a distillation of a 50-page report. And as I said, we don't have too much time, so I'll get right to it. All right. So on the first slide, we have some statistics. In the first 4 months of COVID-19, the New York City Commission on Human Rights received 145 reports of coronavirus-related anti-Asian hate incidents. And you know, it says here it's 12 times the year before, and frankly, there are a lot of different stats. The other one that's in a report that I like to cite to is from the NYPD, and they had in the first quarter of 2020, last year, 23 arrests were made for racially motivated crimes, and 39.1% of those were reported with an anti-Asian bias, compared to only 6.1% the year before. So that's a nearly sevenfold increase. However way you slice it, it's a huge increase. And this is just talking about New York. I know some of you maybe following this might have seen national reports about a figure of 150% and 150%. I kind of feel like that's low, and maybe that's an average of all the cities. But as you all know, New York has a very high number of Asian Americans in the population, and therefore we actually are number 2 in the country after San Francisco in terms of experiencing incidents of hate against Asians. And the chart here is from the NYPD, and you see the sharp spike there. Whoops. Okay, so we also have heard a lot about Stop AAPI Hate. We work closely with them, with Professor Jung there in particular from UCSF. And they helped us with compiling this data specific to New York. And as you see from this chart, the majority of incidents involve verbal harassment, but there's also a fair amount of shunning and physical assault. And one interesting bit as noted here is that New York data shows a greater number of transportation-related incidents. And that's not surprising given how many Asian Americans take public transportation in New York. Some more stats to show the impact of the pandemic on Asian Americans. And we here just highlight the impact on the healthcare workers. So what this shows here is that even though Asian Americans represent only 5.9% of the total US population, we represent in New York 11.6% of the essential healthcare workers. And as we've been hearing all last year, a lot of the frontline healthcare workers were the ones who were most impacted by the pandemic because they're dealing with a crush of cases. One thing that the report spotlighted is the fact that a lot of the nurses, in fact, are Filipinos. And there's been a devastating toll on Filipino American nurses as a result of the pandemic. Nearly 1/3 of all nurse deaths are Filipino Americans, despite making up only 4% of all nurses in the US. We go next to some of the challenges that are discussed in the report. And here, I'm going to turn to Chris to talk about the first two, which is the historical background behind the anti-Asian xenophobia and discrimination, as well as the spread of inaccurate and incomplete information during the pandemic. So Chris?
Thank you, Young. So, the history of Asians in America, and one of these questions came in through the Google form. So I'm going to fold that question into me talking about the history of violence and hatred against Asians in America. The Chinese were the first to come to America in large numbers in the middle of the 19th century. They came in response to the gold rush. They were looking for gold. They stuck around. They found that economic opportunity and sort of being replacement labor after slavery had ended. They helped build big projects like the railroad, and they built much of the agricultural infrastructure in the American West. But the Chinese, after their labor was sort of used, were not welcomed as citizens. So, we all know about the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, because that's where it eventually went. But in the period up to that, from 1849 to 1882, there was lynchings of Chinese, driving Chinese out of, towns, laws, directed against them owning property, and perhaps most important of all, the Chinese were not allowed to naturalize as citizens. They could not become citizens. It's important to remember that before the Chinese started coming to America in large numbers, the immigration restrictions that existed in America, there wasn't really any. It was basically an open border. So if you actually look at the history of immigration restrictions and laws and all things like that, they really happened in response to the Chinese. And talking about the Chinese, like, why do we talk about the Chinese? Sorry, there's just a lot of them, but they also set a framework for how immigration from Asia would be treated. And eventually the Chinese Exclusion Act would essentially become the Asian Exclusion Act, where much of Asia, drawing that sort of brush very broadly, would be prohibited from coming to America by law. And if they got here through some ways, they could not naturalize as citizens. They eventually got, through birthright citizenship, some citizenships, but the affirmative decision was that non-whites could not naturalize as U.S. citizens because they were not welcome as such. The second one, and I think Grace actually, talked about it. There was very little information. If there was not a nonprofit, nonprofits, and there were a couple around the country taking this information, it would have all happened, and nobody would have been able to create policy or arguments out of it. And that's why it's so important. If I might just add that government service or public service is important because you need people in government who understand the population, that when the need comes up, they can say, hey, there's incomplete and inaccurate information, and we really need to deal with it. Okay. Young, give the mic back to you.
Thanks, Chris. I have to unmute. It's the common refrain of
Zoom.
COVID-19 era. Let me go through some of the other challenges that the report discusses. There is the underreporting of incidents. So despite all the statistics that are out there, and Grace mentioned the 3,800 number that has been floated quite widely from Stop API Hate, but that's widely known to be an underreported number because most incidents go unreported. And then the frustration is the reported incidents get met with inaction. And what I like to say, and Chris is probably tired of me saying this, is that if I go to one more presentation from a city agency or government agency or nonprofit group that says that the Asian community has to step up and report. We've been hearing this since a year ago. And the fact of the matter is we have been reporting. People have stepped up. Those 3,800 reports didn't come from nowhere. But the problem is what we also hear is once people step forward, report to the police, they don't do anything with it. The anecdote that I like to share is the one involving the 89-year-old senior who was attacked in Brooklyn over the summer by a couple of teenagers. The senior didn't speak English well, but she had a daughter who did. And she went with her mom to the local precinct, showed up, and the response they got from the police was, well, were there any racial epithets? Did they say any bad things about Chinese? And they had to say no. And so they were sent home, and nothing was done. It's frustrating to, on the one hand, hear from law enforcement and government and authorities telling us to report. But at the same time, one of the things that we surfaced in the report was the fact that a year later, after all the reports of incidents were out there in the public and known by the authorities, there is yet a prosecution. I know there have been arrests. There may be charges, but to date, as far as we know, there have been no convictions. Given the recent surge in the last in the first quarter of the year, I do think that NYPD and DA's offices have stepped up. Chris and I were at a meeting with the Brooklyn DA's office yesterday, and there were some encouraging reports about certain indictments from recent events that have happened. So I think we're seeing some positives there, but I feel like, Albany's been chanting about this for well over a year, and it took, finally now, a year later, for any kind of concrete action to materialize. So the next two challenges kind of combine the lack of anti-Asian hate crime charges and prosecutions. Some of that could be attributed to the state of the law and difficult legal standards. When we approach the DA's offices and ask why they're not charging certain incidents as hate crimes, they point us to the law and talk about the need to show evidence of racial intent. And that's not always there. A lot of these attacks are random, and it's kind of hit and run in the sense that the perpetrator will run up to an Asian person, hit them, and then run off, and then they're heard from again, and they can't be found again. And as in the case of the 89-year-old senior, there were no statements apparently from her attackers. So we're confronting that challenge in terms of trying to find accountability for these attacks. And another big challenge is social and political conflict among the various diverse populations in New York. And so that would take us to the next slide, which talks about the spectrum of different views, even within the Asian community, about this topic, right? So you run the gamut from demanding more government action, demanding more police attention, let's get an Asian hate crime task force set up. But then that hits up against the need for police reform, defund the police. And then there's a great tension between protecting victims' rights versus criminal justice reform, and mass incarceration. As Grace said, let's not hate crime our way out of this. And finally, there's both cooperation and tension among minority groups. And one good example from the recent past is the Kai Gurley case with Peter Leong. And in fact, there's a very good documentary about that called Down a Dark Stairwell, about the pushes and pulls and the innate conflicts, within the relationship between the Asian community and other communities of color. One thing I do want to note from the report, though, is that with the push to defund the police, one of the outcomes of that was that on June 30th last year, the city council passed a city budget that redistributed $1 billion from the NYPD to spend for education, summer programming for youth, social and family services, and public housing. But among the cuts in the budget from that redistribution was $1 million to the Hate Crimes Prevention Initiative, which is a program that allowed various nonprofit organizations to take reports of hate crimes from residents who might not otherwise have felt comfortable calling the police. So that's an example of how these tensions sometimes work counterproductively, which is unfortunate. So the report ends with 7 proposed initiatives. Time will not allow me to fully discuss all of them, but I'll list them out and talk about a couple of them. Our first proposal is clear reporting mechanisms for victims. Second is uniform and consistent classification and prosecution of hate crimes. Third is to have increased representation of Asians in law enforcement and public office and the courts. There's a need for greater public education. There's a need to improve unity and collaboration among minority groups and people of color. I think there's a good argument to be made that legislative reform is needed in the area of hate crimes legislation. And finally, what are some civil actions or forms of relief that we can pursue to address these issues? Because it's not all hate crimes. Some are bias incidents and may not rise to the level of crime, but nevertheless, there are victims that should be provided a measure of justice and relief that may not be otherwise afforded through the criminal penal system. So with regard to clear reporting mechanisms, I already mentioned to you the frustration I have of yet another government agency telling us to report. But the fact of the matter is, there are very many avenues to report, and it could be a dizzying array, especially for a population that may not have English as its first language and may have certain cultural barriers toward coming forward to authorities. So we propose not just clear reporting, but to make the process easier, including making a process available more online. I alluded to some of the problems with the state of the hate crimes legislation, which inhibits the ability of victims to pursue justice through prosecution. But what we're also encountering, through our own advocacy and research, is that the lack of diversity in law enforcement, in elected office, in the courts also hurts us, because I think part of the problem is that those who are in the position to prosecute, to provide justice, don't fully understand or appreciate how Asian Americans experience racism in this country. Some of the history and background that Chris shared with us may be known to us as Asian Americans, but outside of this population, it's complete news. In fact, I think because we suffered under the burden of the modern minority myth, people think that Asian Americans don't suffer discrimination, that they're all doing well, and that they don't need any help. And I think what's been happening in the last year plus with Asian businesses suffering, with Asian Americans being attacked just for the way they look, shows you that we are far from the modern minority, and we definitely need help. Public education campaign, part of what we're doing here now is spreading news about our report and the history and the impact and the proposed solutions is that. And we actually do think that much more public education awareness is needed. So we're very grateful that you are all here to listen in. And we do hope that if you haven't already read a report, that you will pick up a copy. It's also available online. Read it, share it, especially with people who are, in the general population who don't understand our history or our background or our struggle. So with that, Chris, I will stop the share and turn it back to you.
Thank you, Young. And, part of AAPI's report, it does take certain positions, but it also, wants to paint the picture and sort of let you decide. And we want to encourage everyone to be an engaged citizen. I think that's the most important part. In order to be an engaged citizen in this country, you need to know history, you need to know, politics, you need to be interested in things that are outside of things that will get you a high-paying job. And, we were all there at Stuyvesant, so we know the pressure to go to what is thought to be a big name school and to focus on science and math, because it is a science and math school, I know. But the other things are important for you to be an engaged citizen. And in moments of social crisis like this, those people that are there in the legislature, that are there in the business community, are important to help lead that community. And one such person is Joanne Kwong, and who's been patiently waiting. And so I'm gonna turn it over to, so she's heard all these things, and I want to sort of give her the microphone now.
Chris, thank you so much. Chris and Young, that report, it's hard to make people feel teary over data, but I think a lot of the data points are so personal to us because so many of us feel it. just walking the streets. I want to echo the Congresswoman's thanks to everyone for putting on this event, because I think to many of us, especially those of us now that have maybe 30 years of distance from high school, I think we realize how important these conversations are, and to just to make space for our young people. We're kind of in uncharted territory. Like this is, you know, it's not really by accident that, you know, Grace and Sue and I and Ashley and Chris are around the same age. And that's because many of our parents, you know, they came after 1965, which is when they were first allowed to come. And many of us now are in our 40s. We feel this civic responsibility, like Chris mentioned, to participate and take leadership in our cities and in our nation. And it makes me so proud every time I see Grace in front of Congress or speaking to President Biden or Vice President Harris. And if you haven't seen it, you should Google her when she really let one of her Republican colleagues have it for you know, painting a target on the backs of our grandparents and children. And that just made me so proud. So thank you, Grace, for that. You know, to have that representation, to have people like Chris and Young making data, to have Principal Yu and Sue in positions of leadership. For me, just a little bit about my story. You know, typical Stuyvesant kid, you know, went to college and law school and graduate school. When I was in college, I spent much of my junior year spring semester protesting for ethnic studies at Columbia. And, you know, we took over buildings and slept in libraries. And that to me was one of those experiences that has stayed with me my whole life. So I did go on to practice law, and then I did a little career pivot. I was recruited to work at Barnard College up at Columbia, creating programs and initiatives for women's leadership and education. And then when my husband's family's business, Pearl River Mart, you know, it's a classic New York City real estate story. They had always built up every neighborhood that they had a store in, and they were always priced out of the neighborhood. And I think when a store that I grew up with, really the first crossover retail store that I had ever seen, where I would see Chinese people and non-Chinese people shopping together in Chinatown, like that meant a lot to me. And when a community is as young as the Asian American community, because really the concept of being Asian American is only about 50 years old. You know, when you have these pillars in Chinatown or in the Asian American community, and they're at risk of dying for whatever reason, whether it be funding or, you know, landlords or real estate, you know, it is incumbent upon you to do whatever you can, really to be able to kind of build on the work of people who came before us. So, you know, while working in women's education, I thought there were so many women, other women who could be advancing women's issues, but there is only a handful of people who can be doing the work at this level for Asian Americans. So as a small business owner, if you're not familiar with Pearl River, you should come. By the way, we have stores downtown, and it's basically an Asian American department store. So it has, you know, clothing and snacks and toys and gifts and things like that. It was started by my father-in-law in 1971 when he was a recent immigrant. And like many of his generation, he has a PhD in chemistry from the University of Chicago, and he did work at Princeton. But he felt so passionate about the fact that at the time, you know, relations between the US and China were frozen. Trade was embargoed. And to him, that didn't make sense, that there was so much, I don't know, suspicion or, you know, ill feelings towards people of Chinese descent. So his thought, he's kind of a rabble rouser in Chinatown, was to create this store. And it was a very subversive thing where you welcome people into your home or your store, and they begin to see you as 2D, you become a 3D person. And then if you take something home because you purchased something at the store, it stays in your home. You remember this person, you remember that experience. And that's kind of led Pearl River throughout this whole time. So really, you know, in the 50 years since, it's become this shopping destination. But it's, you know, shopping has always been just the vehicle by which we advance culture and community. So it's been a pillar in the Chinatown community. And I joined about 4.5 years ago. And, you know, since then, I think, you know, my mission has been to modernize it for the next generation. So, you know, for Gen Z and then beyond, you know, can they still have this brick and mortar place to feel proud about being Asian American, to learn about our, you know, people who are doing interesting work, and to tell the stories so that, you know, Asian Americans in this country become, you know, so much more than these 2D pernicious stereotypes. So, you know, rocket scientists, poets, dancers, all of this, that these are kind of the images that we try to, you know, push out on Instagram and social media and in our storytelling, which seems a little strange for a business, but, you know, you can really bring your passion and your civic responsibility into any type of job that you have, including being a small business owner, or even if you're, you know, making, you know, gobs of money, as Chris mentioned, there are ways to give back to the community. So this year's experience since the pandemic happened, you know, has just been devastating, right? So some of the data that Young mentioned, you know, 1 in 3 nurses who passed of COVID were Filipino American. I mean, that is just a horrifying statistic. On top of that, there has been the economic devastation for small businesses. And the xenophobia is something that, you know, I saw with my staff, many of whom are Asian American, as early as January, because many of us were used to wearing masks because it's courteous, right? When you have a cold, in Asia, it's quite common to wear masks, but they were scared to do that, but they were also scared to catch you know, the virus. And the conversations that I've had with my staff, many of whom are young, I don't hire high school students anymore, but I do hire college students. And it's such a frightening time, and I don't have the answers, but at least I have my thoughts, and how, you know, we can help each other. So really, when the pandemic hit, my number one concern was keeping everybody alive, keeping the business alive so that people could put food on their tables and support their families, keeping everybody healthy, and keeping everybody safe. So as, you know, New York reopened over the months, you know, it's this heavy responsibility that weighs on me. Do you feel safe leaving your home to come to work? You know, in a way, it seems so silly because I don't want to put people in danger, you know, every time they sit on the subway. And you know, it's these conversations that I think you would never have in a corporate environment, but because we're a family business, and because many of our employees are Asian American, like, these are the conversations that we're having. And I've cried with them because, you know, I want to help figure them out. And I feel an obligation as a leader in the community, as a leader in Chinatown, to kind of be leading the way during this confusing time. So, you know, as the months went on, you know, the stats kind of show themselves. It was this drumbeat of, and you've seen them all, these videos online. And I think many of us are of mixed mind, you know, of the productivity of showing that, yes, we need to see it, but also it's so disheartening every time you see these videos online. So, you know, I don't have the answers, but we do need to know that it's happening, and what can we be doing to fix it. The shooting.
Yeah, no, sorry, go on.
Okay, yeah, the shootings in Atlanta were this spark, and also for many of us, kind of the last straw in a very, very difficult year, right? just, I think from what I could see of my colleagues who lead businesses or are out in the media or in leadership positions, just these generations of grief and rage and, decades of feeling invisible and not really just having these very complex emotions that were hard to describe. As a very visible and vocal Asian American business, it does make me scared, that we're public, our doors are open to anybody. And, each and every day for my employees and my in-laws, what we've done is, curtail hours. We've switched shifts. In the past couple of weeks, things that I never thought that I would do have become normalized. So ordering pepper spray or alarms for my employees and loved ones, really thinking about modes of transportation, like, can I deal with the stress of taking the subway today? Or, can I, or should I Uber it? Which, I recognize that, that's a privilege to be able to have that choice. And even profiling people in the street, like, is this person a danger to me? That takes such a stress on your body and your mind. And I know that many of you feel this way. But I've also experienced a lot of amazement and hope within the community, how just my small community in Chinatown have really stepped up to kind of protect our elders and most vulnerable. I think taking a leadership role in civic life is something that I want every Stuyvesant grad to feel that need and obligation, because our experience growing up in New York City, it's such a diverse place, and at Stuyvesant especially, it is so special to me. Like, my high school classmates are some of the most empathetic and just remarkable people that I know because of the way that we grew up. Just having people of all different backgrounds. And, the more people who are involved in civic life who have had this background, I think the better.
And then if I might sort of interject that, thinking about civic life and how you fit in can come in any number of ways. Young came to civic life after a life of being a corporate lawyer, and Joanne's business that she took over had a wonderful space in the mezzanine, where she had sort of artists exhibit photography, artwork. She exhibited Corky Lee, an important Asian American photographer who passed away in January of this year, because of COVID-19. He was an important figure within the Asian American community. And if you don't know him, you should, and you can just Google him. And, it was an amazing space to have him hold for that time, while he did. And then, of course, he went, far too young, But I want to turn to the students, and the students have been here with us, and thank you for joining us. I wanted to sort of, one of the questions from the alumni was, how do we, this space is great. We talk about it so that we can teach each other. We can draw upon shared experiences from across decades, across race, right? How can alumni support you? How has this period of anti-Asian violence and harassment affected you? So maybe it's a two-part question, maybe it's too much, but if you could introduce yourself, whoever wants to take that question and speak a little bit from the student experience.
Yeah, so I'm Alice, one of the leaders of the Stuyvesant Asian Coalition, and one way we have been addressing the issue is, I know the school has different cultural clubs, and we've been doing talk circles, and every club has their own events. Like, for example, with the Stuyvesant Asian Coalition, we've started this initiative where we share stories and advice in our Facebook group. And we've also hosted a discussion on the recent anti-Asian hate crimes. So I think just really, the first step is really just educating others and educating yourself. So what everyone could do is join in on these discussions and really just educate everyone.
Thank you, Alice. Would another current student like to take that question?
Yes, hello. I'd love to add on to Alice. My name is Xiao Shan, and I am a current junior at Stuyvesant, so a class of 22 that hasn't happened yet. And I think one important thing to note is that I think as students, we don't really get in touch with our like families, actually enough. Like I remember back then in elementary school, I had one particular classmate who was like, oh, my great grandmother was a princess. And I went back and I realized, oh, I don't even have a family tree. So I believe I heard a lot of stories from my classmates who are like, oh, my parents don't want me to speak Mandarin or their native language. And in order to do that, they actually never spoke their native language since they were babies. And they actually really want to get in touch with these cultures. And I think that is just an idea that a lot of people have since the very beginning. And I was surprised that this was actually still happening today. And I'm very happy that at STI we offer so many amazing classes like Asian American literature. And I think that's really impressive. I never expected to see something like that happen at any school. And I believe that a lot of alumni and our principal is here today. So if we could have more of these classes, that would be so, so amazing because as an Asian American, you don't really get in touch with this identity. You never really go around thinking, I am an Asian American, I have so much history, or you're never really proud of this identity. So if we could learn more about this, because as everyone said before, when you look at our history textbooks, you don't see any of these things that we just talked about. So if we could maybe even have a class that directly focus on these, even if our main US history classes does not, I think that would be a great thing. And I believe a lot of students, a lot of alumni, a lot of parents would be glad to see those as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other students want to speak to those questions?
Hi, my name is Christopher, and I'm also a leader of the Stuyvesant Asian Coalition. And I guess I just want to add on to Xiao Shen's point with the idea where I feel like at STI we have a unique experience in that there are so many Asian American students, but I feel like there's still this element of feeling like a foreigner or feeling outcast from the main school community. And I think that a lot of this comes from the school curriculum where you don't see that Asian American representation that you would hope to see in, for example, like US history courses, where a lot of the focus is on the white experience. And so I think in addition to having specialized courses where you can experience the Asian American perspective, I think it's also important to integrate the Asian American story and the Asian American experience into what we're learning in schools and what we're talking about in our discussions, because I think that the Asian American experience in the United States and around the world is equally as important as that of other groups and other minorities.
Thank you. And I'm going to share like a story and then turn it into a question for, I think, anyone else that wants to come in from the panel. You know, when I was in high school and we were there around the same time, and Joanne has pointed that that was a very specific and important time in their immigration history, particularly for Asian Americans. There was a class, an elective social studies class taught by Donan about racism in America. And I was very happy to take it. It was fascinating. In many ways, it was probably my first formal introduction to the study of race, right? I was very lucky to take it. But I also remember feeling a little detached from it because there was a black, white, and I didn't feel like I had a voice within that class. There was a certain sort of alienation that I felt as I went through the class. And so I feel like this is an important moment, and it set me in a lifetime of searching for answers about myself, about race, about where I fit in, where I belong. So I guess the question I want to pose to the other panelists is, how did your STI experience, shape you, your perception of race, your perception of yourself? Joanne talked about junior year, sort of, protesting for ethnic studies. But what did your STI experience teach you about what you're using now in your everyday life and in the work that you're doing? I'm just going to sort of put that out there.
I'll go ahead and take that. I think many of, just speaking for myself, my junior high school was not like the best junior high school. So I really felt a lot of the time I had to minimize myself, how maybe, smart I was or curious. And, coming to STI was a place where, you met other people who, were really curious and interested in school. And I do feel like, you know, the early 90s were kind of a golden time, where, you know, you know, I feel like my friends in high school were of all races and backgrounds and socioeconomic backgrounds. We all took the train. It's funny because like when a lot of the anti-Asian violence happened, we have a group chat with some of my best friends from high school. You guys should get on that. And and you know, we wrote to each other that some of the random violence felt like being back in high school again, because you know, growing up in the city was not the easiest, but I think it did make you a little bit sturdier, and it made you learn how to navigate different spaces, and code switch in a way. So I think that's you know, part of really the strength of every Stuyvesant student.
Absolutely. Young or Grace, did you have anything to talk about maybe from your STI experience and how that's affected the work that you do today?
For me, I feel like going to a school like Stuyvesant gave me more confidence in being who I am and understanding, you know, different components of our culture wasn't necessarily weird or odd or un-American. And it was really at Stuyvesant, because we had a larger AAPI population, that I sort of gained that confidence in myself. But looking back, and I'm so impressed, you know, with the students who are here today, what Christopher said actually also really resonated with me, that even though I felt comfortable in my own skin because there were so many people that looked like me, I still somehow knew and thought that I wasn't necessarily truly American enough, and that only in this space during high school, during the day, was I more fully accepted than was I, you know, somewhere else. And I will say that, you know, as a kid at Stuyvesant, as a student, I was probably one of the shyer, more introverted students. And so I wasn't as bold as Joanne. um, you know, but I think that in events of the past year, even though I'm in politics, it really took the events of this past year, and especially the past few months and the tragedies in Atlanta, to help me fully understand that, you know, oh my gosh, like my history, my upbringing, and my parents' sacrifices are just as American as any other community. And that's sort of like the first time that it really sunk in. And so I think our community, and I agree with Young, I don't want to say we're not speaking up, because we've been speaking up for a year and no one's listened to us. But I think that finally, because of the last few months, the mainstream world is much more attentive and listening to what our concerns are.
Thank you. Young, did you have anything that you wanted to talk about from your days?
Sure. So, you know, I had a similar experience to what Grace was mentioning, because before coming to STI, I would be, you know, the one or two Asian kids in the class. And for me to come to school, and at that time, I think we were more like 1/3 to 40% of the school population. So we hadn't, you know, been as populous as Asian Americans are now in STI. But still, it was like, you know, I look around me and like, wow, I didn't know that there are this many Asian Americans in New York. And so I just tended to naturally gravitate towards other Asians. But the good thing was I also felt like at STI, you know, the non-Asians were also very friendly, and we all got along. So overall, I felt it was a positive experience, and I didn't really feel any sort of a negative effect of being Asian American while at STI. But you know, once I left STI and then, you know, went to college and then law school and then started to work, I realized how much I take it for granted, the fact that it's special to be in a place where there are other people with your background, that you kind of don't have to explain yourself, and there's almost an automatic recognition of each other. And I will note that when I was a junior, 1982, that was the year that Vincent Chin was murdered. And frankly, I don't remember hearing about that case, although I do have vague memories of protests happening, in Chinatown, but I didn't really fully appreciate what was happening. I have a vague recollection of my dad referencing the case and about how a Chinese man was mistaken for Japanese, and it was his way of saying, just be careful. Like you may think that you have non-Asian friends, you speak English perfectly, and that's gonna be carte blanche, and everybody's gonna love you and accept you. Just look at what happened, with this kid, who was mistaken for being Japanese, and I really couldn't disagree with that. Couldn't really argue against it. And fast forwarding to today, doing what I do now as an Asian American bar association leader. Now I'm surrounded almost exclusively by Asian Americans in the profession. So I feel like I'm still very inspired by seeing all these great Asian American lawyers around me who are doing great things. But I also, I kind of miss the days in Stuyvesant when I could also hang out a lot with, people from other backgrounds with other experiences. So the bottom line is, doing what I do now, I really appreciate my own Asianness, but also really appreciate the need for diversity.
Yeah. And I think to that point, I wanted to, before, sort of Asian Americans writ large, were a big part of Stuy's population. Jewish people were a big part of Stuyvesant, and the fight against anti-Semitism was important to them. And then we fast forward, I think, to the last 4 years. We think about the Me Too movement, BLM, and anti-Asian violence. Although we're focused on anti-Asian violence today, I think I'd like to make a point that all of those fights are linked together. That's why unity is important. Sometimes just people say it's unity, that's important. But the reason why that unity is important is because in the end, if you boil it down, those fights are different manifestations of who's an American. At the very beginning of America, it was a free white male, could be a legal person. No one else had any legal rights. They could not exist. And the fight for America, if you want to pick sort of that arc towards justice, is about fighting for the rights of the people that had not been included, in the law. There was beautiful rhetoric, and we want America to live up to its best rhetoric. But I think that those fights, fighting against anti-Semitism, fighting for the freedom struggle of African Americans, of which Asian Americans have benefited tremendously. We need to remember the linkage. We need to come together. That's why those things are important. And yeah.
Chris, do you mind if I chime in really
please.
quickly? And I know I'm not an official panelist, but I just want to say, just talking a little bit about your original question and about the Stuyvesant experience. I think one of the things that I'm really just tremendously proud of, of all our students, but with our Asian American students, that they're unapologetic about who they are and their curiosities and the things that interest them. One of the things that's really fabulous about the Stuyvesant experience is clearly the academics, but it's all of the other things that are involved with the extracurricular and the sports. And our young people haven't narrowed themselves to just their academics. We've got phenomenal young people who are doing things in theater, in art, on the athletic field. And, and as Congresswoman Mong, just mentioned around being mainstream, like these are our next generation of leaders and, and models and idols for the next generation. I say this to all the young people now, like I have 2 young daughters, 5 and 7, and they're so excited to see the teenagers at Stuyvesant because one, they just think they're really cool, first of all, but secondly, it's just the fact that, they're going to be my daughter's teachers, lawyers, coders, congressional members, all of that. And I love the fact that our young people don't limit themselves and through the Stuy experience, they can see themselves in every aspect of our community, of our society, and clearly of our entire country. So really, again, I think what we're seeing here tonight too is that even when you do great things, you're still going to stay connected to the people and to the experience that helped you get to where you are. And this is really just such a great example of that. And I hope our young people see that. And then I think as all the adults, to hear from what our young people have just said about wanting to make sure that they're seen, heard, and feel relevant, I think that's really an important piece. So just again, so thankful for our community.
Thank you, Principal Yu. I have a question here from Danny Chen, and it's for the current students. I'm going to pivot back to the current students on our panel. How does the current demographics at Stuyv, and that's been in the New York Times, you might have noticed, impact allyship efforts? Because there's not a lot of Black and Latino students. That's been sort of a lot of the issues over the last, sort of couple of years. How does that impact allyship efforts?
I think prior to all of this, we never really appreciated these groups enough because we have a lot of groups. No matter how many people there are at Stuyvesant, there are always someone out there who is willing to speak for their group. I think my faculty advisor for Red Cross, Mr. Angel Colon, is here. I think he facilitates a lot of these clubs, and definitely they do a lot of talk circles just like this one. And I think even though we do have a kind of unbalanced demographic, we do have representation from everyone. Yep.
Yes, I do agree. Like while there are a large majority of Asian students, every club, every like demographic does have its own club. Like there's BSL, there is the South Asian Culture Association, I believe, and there's also things that represent their food. And like, yes, there are a lot of Asians, but that doesn't mean that like nobody gets together to just talk and just spread what they want and what they want to say.
Thank you.
I think just adding on to that, one of the events that was really meaningful to me was one of the talk circles around race, where the Stuyvesant Asian Coalition and BSL and Aspira all came together in a collaboration to make an event where we were able to talk about the experiences of the different minority groups in Stuyvesant. And I think that through these channels, we've been able to hear more of the voices of especially the underrepresented minorities in Stuyvesant, as well as the Asian Americans. But I also think that it's really important that we say that the voices, especially for Black and Latino students, are not heard loudly enough at Stuyvesant, and that it's important for us to include and remain unified along these fronts in order to make change.
Yeah, just to add on to Christopher, I also found that event really impactful. And one thing that really resonated with me was that even though like it was to a different like ethnic group or like minority, all the discrimination like the different minorities faced were like really similar in a way. So that really helped with our allyship. And we really recognized like how every group, even though like Black and Latino students, their voices may be like underrepresented, it was really just how like our discrimination was so similar, and we were able to stand behind all of that.
Chris, I just wanted to add something about allyship. Just to share a story, over the summer during the BLM protests, I wrote a letter to our community about our support for Black Lives Matter. And it was pretty long-winded, it's a long thing. You could check it out on our website. And I was surprised, we sent it out, and that weekend, because keep in mind, this was June when stores were really just opening up for pickup and there weren't a lot of people. Everybody in the store was African-American, and they all came out that weekend to come shopping. And at first, we have a lot of African-American customers. So I was like, oh, okay, but literally everybody in the store was Black. And we thought, oh, that's terrific. When the anti-Asian violence happened recently, right after the shootings in Atlanta, a friend of mine who owns a restaurant in Harlem, Melba's, if any of you have been there, She came down to Chinatown and brought lunch for my entire staff. And I was just so surprised and really just heartened by it. And I just reconnected with her a day or two ago, and I said, I posted about it, and I said, like, you don't know what that meant to my community as well, to see that type of allyship. Like, you know, it wasn't just lunch for my staff; it was the fact that you came from Harlem to Chinatown, and just that effort. And I think what she told me, she was like, "This is not our first day at the rodeo. Like we have been through collective racial trauma as a community, so that's how we know." And I you know, that we need to be gentle and support with food or love. And I think, you know, the Asian American community is relatively young about these issues of race. So that reflex, oh, you know, like, I'm going to go support this business that, you know, stuck its neck out or had a difficult time. You know, that reflex is something that, you know, we should build more of in our community.
Yeah, I mean, I think that reflex is deep within the African American community because of the history of civil rights. You know, Pamela Clark has, you know, it's not just about stopping Asian hate. We're focusing on that now. It's stop all racist hate. And she's absolutely right. And that's why I wanted to sort of underscore that while our focus and our discussion is here, you know, that is, you know, something we definitely subscribe to. That if you boil it all down, it's about sort of, you know, racist structures, the destruction of those structures, so we can imagine a better and more fair society where people can just realize whatever it is that they want to do in their life, you know. And part of that is beginning when you're young, thinking about it, you know, that it's not just, you know, all about, you know, sort of getting the high paying job. It's important, we know, and it might seem like that's all there is, but there's something else too. And sort of, I think the gentle nudge is just to start thinking about it, read it, you know, learn about yourself, think about where you belong, think about what community you want to belong to, because from that community, you'll represent, you'll advocate, and you'll engage. And that's it, right? So we don't have to say you've got to engage this way or that way. That's up to you politically. It's about like being an active citizen. And so when these issues come up, you can make a change in the way that you feel is the right way. You know, for the students, you know, do you guys have any questions for us? You know, like, you know, we hope you're doing okay. We wanted to check in, you know, share our experience. Do you guys have any questions that are on the panel right now that you want to articulate? If it pops up, you guys can pop it up. But I thought that, you know, I could give the panelists each a couple of minutes to, you know, make some final statements, you know, before we close out for the evening. I certainly hope that this will be, you know, a continuing series of talk circles as we engage about the issue of race, because that's what anti-Asian hate is about. It's about the issue of race in America. It's part of a much larger sort of, you know, panorama. And we certainly, you know, sort of recognize that. You know, for last thoughts, should I start with Congresswoman?
Sure. Thank you again, Chris, for doing such an amazing job moderating. I feel like I learned so much today from the questions, from the panelists, and especially from our students. So encouraged by your willingness to be here. You know, you guys talked about talk circles, which reminded me about how intentional we have to be at this moment. It is up to all of us, you and I, on this call to make real change. There's no roadmap. There's nothing we can Google. We are literally charting this path as we are going along. There's no guidebook for this. And what you just talked about with the talk circles really reminded me, you know, I have often been asked, and I'm sure all of my panelists have been too, to speak to, for example, employee resource groups at corporations, right? These are many large companies, they have the Asian American employee group, right? Like the different clubs, like you mentioned. Recently, I was asked to speak at the Asian Employee Resource Group again. And I said, well, I would love to do that, but I would also like to talk to the Black and the Latino and the women's. Like, we don't have to keep ourselves separate in silos, because we're not, that's kind of like preaching to the choir, which is important to be encouraged and reminded, but it's even more important, I think, to be able to share those mutual stories. And so I really just wanted to remind us of how intentional we need to be. And I say this to myself too. There are some nights where I'm like, I literally don't know what to do, but having these conversations is really helpful. And finally, to what Joanne was saying about how our community is relatively young in terms of advocacy, I think of all this like, our community sometimes may lack that vocabulary and that muscle of advocacy. And oftentimes in many of our lives, it is other communities who've been through a lot as well, who are teaching us and showing us and guiding us to help us become more effective advocates for our own community. I will tell you, there are many times in my own political career when I first ran for office, when I was trying to get onto the committee of my choice, the establishment and the people around me, including in my own community, weren't necessarily supportive. And in both those instances, I will tell you, it was members of the Black community who understood why, even before I did probably, why it was important for an Asian American to be on that committee, for example. And the committee I'm talking about is Appropriations Committee. This is a committee in Congress that had my Black colleagues not helped me and not spoken up for me, there would be 0 Asian Americans in that committee in the United States Congress. And that's not okay. That's the agency that the committee that funds the entire US government. And that's just one small example for my life. But I just wanted to show you that I didn't have other Asians at that moment in that meeting to advocate for our community. And it was my Black colleagues in that space. And I can give you many other examples, but it was my Black colleagues in that space who understood that an Asian voice needed to be a part of that committee. So thank you everyone for inviting me here. We will continue this conversation. Thank you, Principal Yu.
Thank you. Yeah.
There are so many things I can't say, but I know I need to keep it short. So what I want to say is that as the Asian American Bar Association, as Albany, we were not content to just write a report and then put it out in the world and have people read it, and then for us to tell people about it. We actually almost immediately after the report was published 2 months ago on Lunar New Year Eve, we started an anti-Asian violence task force within Albany, and we activated many of our committees, such as the Issues Committee, of which Chris is chair, the Pro Bono Committee, the Prosecutors Committee, and many others, to come up with action plans that will implement some of the proposals that we're working on. So, for example, in March, we sent Chris out to the City Council to testify at the Committee on Public Safety to ask the City Council to fully fund the NYPD Anti-Asian Hate Crimes Task Force, because until the report came out, the world didn't realize that these hardworking Asian police officers were doing this in their spare time without compensation as volunteers. And we didn't think that was right. So we asked the City Council to fully fund it. And then a week later, when they had a budget hearing about the DA's offices, well, there's a part in a report where we said that all the DA's offices need to have a hate crimes unit that can adequately address the anti-Asian bias and incidents and crimes that are happening. So Chris went before the same committee and asked for resources to support that. We've been, besides doing a lot of speaking engagements about the report and about this issue, we've tied that together with advocacy. We've visited with DA's offices to put their feet to the fire on standing behind their commitments to fight anti-Asian violence. I mean, as we mentioned, we have yet to see a completed prosecution or conviction out of this. But we're continuing to speak with the DA's offices to keep the pressure on that. But we don't stop there. We're talking to the mayor's office. We're talking to the governor's office. I'm sure we'll be talking to Grace's office sometime soon as well. But we're making the rounds. And then on a longer term horizon, we also have a research arm within this task force to look into proposals for legislative reform, to look into policy reforms. We realize that that's going to take more time, but we have the academic committee with some law professors helping us with that research. But in the short run there, we're also putting together Know Your Rights brochures that we can put out to the community that would be not in legalese, that will be in plain English, that will be translated, that will help members of the community who are facing anti-Asian incidents or violence or harassment, the tools and the knowledge to make effective reporting and to know what to do when they're the subject of these attacks. So our focus really has been on making some forward progress and to advocate for the victims and to bring them some measure of justice and relief from all the terrible attacks and incidents that have been reported in the past year.
Thank you, Young. And Joanne.
My closing message is to the students. You will find throughout your life that you will be in and out of spaces where you might be the only person who cares about issues of race and diversity, maybe the only person who's really thought about it. And whether they're courtrooms or boardrooms or classrooms, and it will be exhausting to always be the one to raise these issues. But in my experience, I feel better because I did. And the times that I let things go, like microaggressions or just little flippant comments, like I still think about them, and you don't want to live with that. So, sometimes these conversations are very uncomfortable, just personally, I had to call out the dean of my law school once, and also the head of my kids' preschool. Like, these are very difficult conversations, you know what I mean? And it's tiring. But again, do it over and over and over. And at some point in your life, in your career, you will realize that you have access and opportunity to provide access and opportunity for others behind you. Don't forget to reach that hand back and to bring your community and others with you. So thank you so much, everybody, for this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. And, for the students, for the community, it's been a pleasure to spend time with you on this important issue. Don't be content just to have all these great alumni, doing great work. This is just a small part of it. So if anyone's asking you what Stuyvesant alumni are doing, they're doing a lot and they're doing great stuff. But count yourself among that, and that we'll look for you, 20 years out, 15 years out. I think, Vax Daddy, has anyone heard of him? We can't find him. He's a Stuyvesant alum too, right? He's done great work, right? In coding. Hunter College High School has like that guy on trial, Max Shrekley. We have Vax Daddy, right? So we're doing good, right? So be proud, but then engage yourself. And I think that's what we want to say. And I want to thank you and give it back to Rachel.
Hey, if I could just say one thing. So I'll tell everyone a funny story. So when Grace was first running for Congress, she had won the primary, and she was just doing the general election. So I held a fundraiser for her with a number of friends that I knew that were interested in politics, so it came out, and one of my friends, who's probably one of the bigger donors, and so very into that world, comes up to me at the end and says, "You know what? If you would ask me which of the 15, 20 people here were running for Congress, I would never have guessed it was Grace." So it's so interesting because I've known Grace obviously for many I guess decades, sadly enough, for all of us. Anyway, we always knew her as somewhat understated and quiet, really, in a lot of ways, so typically Asian, like all of us, and it's so fantastic to see that you found your voice and to see that you speak, not only for, for us, here at STI, but really for all Asian Americans and really all minorities across America. It's so fantastic to see. So I just want to say thank you, and on behalf of all of us, you make us all very proud, and thank you.
Thank you. All right, Rachel.
Yeah, absolutely, Sue. Thanks for that. Thank you, everyone, for attending tonight's discussion. I would like to give a special shout out to Ashley Stevens, who is the classmate of many people on this panel, class of '93, who was a driving force in organizing tonight's event. I also like to extend my thanks to Dina Ingram, Stuyvesant's Director of Family Engagement, and Mr. Angel Cologne from STI in coordinating with the Alumni Association to make sure that we could get this event together. It's given our community a lot to think about and process, and I'm sure we're gonna have many more conversations like this afterward. A recording of this event will be shared afterward. If anyone is interested in getting involved in planning any events like this or getting in touch with any groups at Stuyvesant, please reach out to the Alumni Association. I know that there are many student groups on campus at the school where you could get more involved. They are always looking for alumni speakers and also just other resources to ensure that all Stuyvesant students have as many opportunities as possible. And also, we're putting together a list of resources specifically for Stuyvesant alumni and posting that on our social media and on our website after this event. So with that, thank you all again and have a good rest of your evening.